Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to lecture number 20 of Software Design and Architecture. I am your course instructor Fahad Anwar. So, students, before I start my today's lecture discussion, I would like to give you a little bit recap about our last lecture. So, students, if you remember what we discussed in our last lecture, we see different categories of architectural patterns where we discussed the layer based hierarchical software architecture, in which we see the description of layered based hierarchical software architecture, and we also see a real world example for a library management system as well. And we also discussed application areas or some situations where we can use this layered based hierarchical software architecture, and we also discussed some advantages and limitations of this layered based software architecture as well. So it's a little bit recap about our last lecture. So students, let's formally start of today's lecture discussion. So here is a brief objective of our today's lecture discussion. In our today's lecture discussion, we will discuss a different category of architectural pattern. In our last lecture, we discussed a hierarchical software architecture, and now in this lecture, we will focusing on distributed software architecture. In this category of architectural pattern, we will further divided distributed software architecture into client server architecture and service oriented architecture. So it's a brief objective of our today's lecture discussion. So these are the different categories of architectural styles. In our previous lecture, hierarchical layered based software architecture is already discussed in lecture number 19, and now in this lecture we will discuss distributed software architectural pattern. In this distributed based software architecture, we will further discuss in more detail client server based architectural pattern and service oriented architecture based pattern as well. And now let's start the distributed software architecture discussion. So students, what is distributed software architecture? So students, basically distributed systems, you can say that is a collection of computational and storage devices which are connected through a communication network. So in this type of system, like data, software and users are distributed into different geographical locations, and the subsystems or components within a distributed systems communicate with each other using a number of different methods, like include message passing, remote procedure calls and remote method invocations as well. So now here, two important elements of designing a distributed systems are: number one, network topology. So network topology is basically the way in which entities are organized to form a connected network, and the second most important aspect is a communication mode, which actually describe the method by which components can communicate with each other. So many systems in the real world are naturally distributed. So these systems are widely used in large enterprise environments, such as database system that enables data to be accessed remotely. For example, a B2B system with its distributed suppliers or clients as well. And further, you can say that SAP system to manage distributed resources, or these kind of distributed systems are everywhere. So under the category of distributed architecture based pattern, our first distributed architecture style is client server architectural style. So before I start this client server architectural styles, so the distributed systems can be modeled by the client server architecture as well, and this form is the provide the basis for multi-tier architecture as well. So alternatives are the other architecture as well, like Corba or the service oriented architecture, such as web services and grid services as well. So key features of a distributed architecture are its services to location transparency and its services reliability and availability as well. So additionally, you can say that there are several technologies or technological frameworks to support distributed architecture available. What kind of distributed architecture based technological frameworks available like .NET, J2E, Corba, .NET Web Services, Exix Java Web Services, and Globus Grid Services, etc. So all of these are different kind of technological framework to support distributed architecture. And now in this client server architecture style, basically this architectural pattern or style represents a relationship between two client or two computer program, in which one program is a client and other is a server. So what is a client and a server? So you are as senior students, so you are well aware about the client actually, which makes a service request to server, and server which actually provides services to its different clients. So here is the diagram. You can see that how client server architectural style looks like. So students, in this client server based architecture, the client server architecture can be used within a single computer by program, by it is a more important idea in a network. So one client can be connected through a network, and these two clients can be communicated through a common network. So in a network, the client server architecture allows efficient way to interconnect programs that are distributed efficiently across different geographical locations. So client server architectural styles are mostly suitable for applications that involve distributed data or that process across a range of different components as well. So what kind of components are there? Are two kind of components, servers and the client. Servers are basically standard or alone components that provide specific services such as printing, data management, database services, etc. And the clients, which are the components that can call all these services provided by the server as well. So the next one is connector, which is basically the network which allows the clients to access these kind of services remotely from through the server as well. So students, let's discuss some common example of client server architecture. So in this diagram you can see that how client can make requests to servers, etc. So let's discuss some more common example. For example, through the World Wide Web is an most common example of client server architecture. Each computer that uses a web browser in a client, like you utilizes a Google Chrome or an Internet Explorer, you simply go to the Internet Explorer, any kind of searches you will put into the Google search engine, and the data on the various web pages that those client access is stored on multiple servers. So any kind of web pages which are you requested on a specific browser is actually is an example of client server architecture. So this client server architecture is basically, you can say that in client server architecture, the functionality of the system is organized into services, with each service delivered from a separate server. Like clients are used for are so you can also say that clients are users of these services that access servers to make use of them, etc. So this is a more utilizing the any web browser to get some web pages is the most common example of client server architecture. So another example is about the banking example. So for example, I say, if you have to check a bank account from your computer, you have to send a request to server program at the bank. तो अगर आप अपने बैंक अकाउंट से बैंक अकाउंट अपने कंप्यूटर से अगर आप अपने बैंक अकाउंट को अपने कंप्यूटर से कोई भी रिक्वेस्ट सर्वर के थ्रू सेंड कर रहे हैं, तो जो वो प्रोग्राम का प्रोसेस है, जो वो रिक्वेस्ट फॉरवर्ड कर रहा है, जो अपने क्लाइंट के थ्रू रिक्वेस्ट को सेंड कर रहा है डेटाबेस के मेन सर्वर को, जो किसी भी बैंक का है, कि वो बैलेंस को की जो इन्फॉर्मेशन है उसको रिट्रीव कैसे कर सकता है। तो वो जो बैलेंस सेंड बैक बैंक के डाटा क्लाइंट को किया जा रहा है, जो सर्विसेज रोल बैक करके वो रिटर्न बैक करके क्लाइंट्स को प्रोवाइड की जा रही हैं। सो इट्स बेसिक जो उसको बैलेंस डिस्प्ले ऑफ कर दिया जाता है, तो बेसिकली इट्स अ टाइप ऑफ क्लाइंट सर्वर आर्किटेक्चर। सो इन मोस्ट इजिएस्ट वर्ड आप इजीली ये भी कह सकते हैं कि जो क्लाइंट सर्वर आर्किटेक्चर है, कि एक क्लाइंट है वो अपने बैंक अकाउंट से अपने बैंक बैलेंस को डिस्प्ले करना चाह रहा है, उसको देखना चाह रहा है। वो सिंपली वो रिक्वेस्ट करेगा मेन सर्वर से, जो भी उसका हेड ऑफिस है वो मेन सर्वर से उसको डिस्प्ले बैक करेगा जो भी उसका करंटली बैलेंस है। तो इस तरह से क्लाइंट जो रिक्वेस्ट सेंड करेगा सर्वर को, वो सर्वर उन वेब पेजेस को या उसकी जो भी रिक्वेस्टेड सर्विसेज हैं उसको वो जो भी उसका करंट बैलेंस है, अबाउट करंट बैलेंस इन्फॉर्मेशन है, उसको उसको कंप्यूटर की स्क्रीन के ऊपर वो डिस्प्ले ऑफ कर देगा. सो इट्स अनदर एग्जांपल ऑफ क्लाइंट सर्वर आर्किटेक्चर. सो student, my question to you is, in what kind of scenarios we can use this client server architecture? हम ये जो client server architecture है इनको किन scenarios में utilize करते हैं? So this kind of client server architecture जो है हम use करते हैं share databases में, जहाँ पे हमें database को access करना होता है from a range of different locations, because servers can be replicated, may also be used when the load on a system is variable. So in this kind of situations we can use this kind of client server architecture. Now let's discuss some another example of client server architecture for some film library. So in this example we will see a film and DVD or video library organized as a client server system. So in this diagram you can see that, if in this example you can see that it is based on a client server model. This is a multi user web based system for providing a film photography library. In this system, several server manage and display the different types of media, like video frames need to be transmitted quickly because it is in synchrony mode, but at relatively low resolution, because they may be compressed in a store. So the video server can handle video compression and decomposition in different formats. So for still pictures, however, it must be maintained at high resolution, so it's appropriate to maintain them on a separate server. So here you can see that all of these services are provide independent services. So the catalog must be able to deal with a variety of queries and provide links into the web information system that include data about the film, video clips, and e-commerce system that support the sale of photographs, films, videos. So in this diagram you can see that it provides different services are distributed across a network. So we can also see that general functionality can be available all clients and does not need to be implemented by all services. So it's also an advantage of database client service based architecture as well. So in this diagram, in this example, we see how in this diagram we see how a film and DVD video library organized and as a client server architecture, where we have a separate server for a catalog server, video server, picture server, and a web server. Each client or a user can be independently request different services from these servers separately, which actually provides the independently services to its clients as well. So now next topic is no so next distributed software architecture is service oriented architecture. Till here we discuss the client server architecture, which is a one type of distributed software architecture, and now the second type of distributed software architecture is service oriented architecture. So first of all, my question is, students, what is service? So basically you can say that service is a business functionality. So so this business functionality must be well defined, self contained, and it must be independent from other services as well. So and these services must be available to used or through a standard programming interface as well. So the most important thing is ये जितनी भी services हमें service oriented architecture provide कर रहा है, वो independently specific services या जो भी services provide कर रहे हैं, वो independently different services अपने user को interface level के ऊपर प्रोवाइड कर रहे हों. सो इट्स अ बेसिक concept about service. So what is a service oriented architecture? Now we will discuss about the service oriented architecture. So service oriented architecture is a basic centric architectural approach which supports the integration at your business, which actually links your business, like repeatable business tasks or different level of services are provided by this service oriented architecture. So students, now different software managers like business processes through a software oriented architecture with well defined standard interfaces that can build, enhance, and expand their existing infrastructure more flexibly. So service oriented architecture, these services can be extensively reused within a given domain or a product line, even among legacy system as well. So uh, we can define this service oriented architecture in a more comprehensively as in this slide. So we can say that service oriented based software architecture is basically provide as a business functionality which are logically grouped and encapsulated into self-contained distinct reusable components, which we call them as services. And these kind of services represents at a high level of business concepts which can be distributed over a different networks and can be reused to create different business applications as well. And these services can contain with the specification of the purposes, different functionalities, graphical user interfaces, different constraints, their uses into the different business functionalities as well. So it is a brief discussion about service oriented architecture. So the connection between services are conducted by common and universal message oriented protocol such as web services protocol, which can deliver requests and responses between services loosely. So a connection can be established statically or dynamically in the service oriented architecture. So so you can get better idea about the service architecture if you look into this diagram. What is the service architecture? So basically a collection of service oriented architecture provides as a in the most top layer a collection of different services which we call them the name with services. So these kind of services are classified into different types into layer 2. You can see that in the layer 2 these services we have a generic term services for our end user which are actually interacting with the system. And now user can get different type of services from the layer 2. And now these different type of services are further arranged into layer at level number or layer number 3. So each type of services are arranged into different layers, and the most bottom layer, all of these layers are governed by architecture patterns and policies. So students, it's all about the service architecture. So let's discuss this service architecture with the help of banking example as well. So so students, let's discuss this banking example in more detail. So if you see in this example, let's student consider there are several areas of banking applications which deal with the current balance of an existing customer. So we can say that more often like we want to get current balance. So functionality is repeated in various applications within a banking environment. So these repeated applications actually provide as a redundant or a duplicated programming scenario. So due to this reusability, the focus should be towards finding the sort of common reusable component or a functionality which can be implemented as a service. So to get the current balance, we want to reuse these modules or a component within a banking environment. So we want to get some programming scenario where these redundant components can be efficiently reused so that the services that all banking applications can be reuse the services as and when they are necessary as well. So let's discuss another example of service oriented architecture. So students, if we look into this example, uh, आप इस जस्ट इस एग्जांपल को एक बार देखें सर्विस ओरिएंटेड आर्किटेक्चर को। ये हमारे पास एग्जांपल क्या है? सो इफ़ यू लुक इनटू दिस एग्जांपल, ये एक ट्रैवल एजेंसी सिस्टम है हमारे पास। इस ट्रैवल एजेंसी सिस्टम है जिसके अंदर हम डिफरेंट सर्विसेज ओरिएंटेड आर्किटेक्चर की बेस्ड के ऊपर इसको डेवलप किया गया है। सो ये जो सर्विस ओरिएंटेड आर्किटेक्चर है इसके अंदर हमारे पास बेसिक कंस्ट्रेंट्स हैं जिसमें डिफरेंट बिजनेस रूल्स हैं। लाइक बिजनेस रूल्स क्या हो सकते हैं हम ट्रैवल एजेंट सिस्टम के लिए, एजेंसी सिस्टम के लिए, कि बजट क्या है, ट्रेन जो हमारा ट्रैवल एजेंसी का शेड्यूल का एटसेट्रा, दीज आर द कंस्ट्रेंट्स। और वर्क फ्लो क्या है कि हाउ ट्रैवल एजेंट clients get the services from different architecture levels as well. So this service oriented architecture is basically consists of 4 existing web services, like if you see airline reservation, car rental, hotel services, like attraction or different kind of reservation services as well. So in this diagram you can see that all of these all of these web services are independently are being provided to a travel agent client. So it's also an example of service oriented architecture. So from this diagram you can get better idea about how the service oriented architecture is actually look like, where how independent services are actually being provided to our client. So now let's discuss the key aspects of services which are actually being discussed in this service oriented architecture. So now what kind of services, what can be key aspects about these services? So let's discuss all of these like 8 to 10 aspects of services one by one. I will provide you details about all of these aspects of services. Like first one is loose coupling. So what does it mean? So in this loose coupling we can say that like the inherently unreliable communication over the internet must not lead to a blocked system. कि जो भी हमारे पास इनहेरेंटली अनरिलायबल कम्युनिकेशन है इंटरनेट के ऊपर, वो हमारे सिस्टम को ब्लॉक्ड करने की तरफ नहीं जानी चाहिए. सो इट्स अबाउट द लूज कपलिंग. सो द नेक्स्ट वन इज सर्विस कॉन्ट्रैक्ट एस्पेक्ट ऑफ सर्विसेज. तो सर्विस कॉन्ट्रैक्ट क्या है कि जो भी हमारा सर्विस कॉन्ट्रैक्ट है उसको कम्युनिकेशन एग्रीमेंट के थ्रू जो भी हमने स्पेसिफाइड डिटेल्स को किया है कि हमारा जो सिस्टम है कौन कौन सी सर्विसेज प्रोवाइड करेगा, कौन कौन सी सर्विसेज को परफॉर्म करेगा. इट्स all of these aspects are covered in this service contract. And the next one is autonomy. So what is autonomy? Like autonomy mean services should have control over the logic they encapsulate actually is. So the next one is abstraction. So what is abstraction? So abstraction mean services representation are at an abstract level कि जो भी services हम represent कर रहे हैं वो हमारी abstract level के ऊपर हों. So abstract level के services mean if you remember the last example, जैसा कि हमने एक last example देखी थी कि services abstract level के ऊपर कैसे थी हमारे ऑनलाइन ट्रैवल एजेंट सिस्टम के ऊपर. लाइक हम एयरलाइन रिजर्वेशन को abstract लेवल पे प्रोवाइड कर रहे हैं विदाउट गोइंग इनटू मोर डिटेल्स what are the actually in this airline reservation. And the next one was the car rental, hotel reservation. So all of these services are at the abstract level. We don't need to go into more deeper details about these architectural services, etc. And now the next one is reusability. So reusability is already discussed in the banking example. बैंकिंग एग्जाम्पल के अंदर हम रीयूजबिलिटी एक्सपेक्ट सर्विसेज को ऑलरेडी डिस्कस कर चुके हैं कि एक क्लाइंट अपने बैलेंस को करंट बैलेंस को डिफरेंट बैंकिंग की ब्रांचेस के अंदर व्यू करना चाह रहा है. तो ये रीयूजेबिलिटी जितने भी कंपोनेंट्स हैं वो करंट अकाउंट बैलेंस के जितने भी मॉड्यूल्स हैं सर्विसेज हैं उनको उस सर्विसेज के मॉड्यूल को एफिशिएंटली डिफरेंट प्रोग्रामिंग सिनारियो से उसको रीयूज़ करेंगे. सो रीयूजेबिलिटी इज आल्सो एन इंपॉर्टेंट एस्पेक्ट ऑफ सर्विसेज प्रोवाइडेड इन सर्विस ओरिएंटेड आर्किटेक्चर. एंड नाउ द नेक्स्ट वन इज कंपोजिबिलिटी. सो कंपोजिबिलिटी इज एक्चुअली अबाउट सर्विसेज कैन बी कंपोज्ड विद इन अदर सर्विसेज टू फॉर्म सिस्टम. कंपोजिबिलिटी का मतलब क्या है कि ये जो सर्विसेज मिलाकर हम अदर सर्विसेज सिस्टम के साथ मिलकर जो सिस्टम को फॉर्म कर रहे हैं. एक्चुअली अबाउट द कंपोजिबिलिटी कि हाउ डिफरेंट सर्विसेज कैन बी कंपोज्ड विद इन अदर सर्विसेज टू फॉर्म अ full system. And next one is statelessness. So it is also pretty straightforward, like services should minimize retaining information specific to an entity as well. And now the next one is discoverability. So discoverability mean for the services to be used client must know of their existence. So services thus must be discoverable कि जो भी हम सर्विसेज प्रोवाइड कर रहे हैं कि हमारा जो भी जैसे हमारा ऑनलाइन ट्रैवल एजेंसी सिस्टम है कि जो भी सर्विसेज हम यूज़र को प्रोवाइड कर रहे हैं वो सर्विसेज डिस्कवरेबल भी हों. लाइक डिस्कवरेबल मीन कि हम एयरलाइन रिजर्वेशन प्रोवाइड कर रहे हैं, होटल सर्विसेज प्रोवाइड कर रहे हैं. सो ऑल ऑफ दीज सर्विसेज जो हैं वो डिस्कवरेबल भी हों, यूज़र इन सर्विसेज को यूटिलाइज भी कर सके. सो दिस इज़ द डिस्कवरेबिलिटी एस्पेक्ट ऑफ सर्विसेज. So students, all of these are different aspects of services which is actually provided by the service oriented architecture. And now there are some advantages of service oriented architecture as well. So what are the advantages? Let's discuss these advantages of service oriented architecture one by one. So the first one advantage is loosely coupled connection. So what is loosely coupled connection? So loosely coupling is the key attribute of service oriented architecture. Like each service component is independent due to stateless service feature. So the implementation of service will not affect its application as long as the exposed interface is not changed. So this makes service oriented architecture much easier to evolve and update as well. कि जो भी हमारे पास इम्प्लीमेंटेशन ऑफ सर्विस की है वो इफ़ेक्ट नहीं करेगी उसकी एप्लीकेशन को, जब तक उसको हम इंटरफेस लेवल के ऊपर एक्सपोज ना कर दें या उसको चेंज ना कर दें। सो ये जो लूजली कपल्ड कनेक्शंस हैं, इट इज़ एन इम्पॉर्टेंट प्रॉपर्टी of service oriented architecture because it ultimately makes software service oriented architecture based software much easier to evolve and update with respect to time as well. And now the next advantage is interoperability. So what is interoperability? If I am technically speaking, you can say that interoperability is about like जो भी client है जो services को access कर सकता है, जो कोई भी client है वो सर्विसेज को एक्सेस कर सके अदर सर्विसेज को जो भी प्रोवाइड की जा रही हैं रिगार्डलेस ऑफ दैट प्लेटफॉर्म टेक्नोलॉजी, जो भी वेंडर है, लैंग्वेज इंप्लीमेंटेशंस हैं, इन कंस्ट्रेंट से हटकर जो भी सर्विसेज प्रोवाइड की जा रही हैं वो इंटरऑपरेबिलिटी एक फ्रेमवर्क से दूसरे फ्रेमवर्क में दीज काइंड ऑफ सर्विसेज को एक्सेस कर सके. सो दिस इज एक्चुअली अबाउट द इंटरऑपरेबिलिटी. एंड द next one is reusability. We already discussed this reusability, like any service can be reused by any other service as well, as we discussed the getting current account balance in the banking system as well. We all already discussed this reusability term in our previous slide as well. And now the next one is scalability. So this service oriented architecture also provide us the scalability. So it's pretty straightforward. Loosely coupled services are easy to scale. So we can say that the document oriented or a services features enhance the scalability attribute. So if in service oriented architecture, it all because it provides a loosely coupled connections, so these loosely coupled services are easily to scalable. So now why we now my next question to student you is why we need service oriented architecture. So if you brainstorm, if you do some brainstorming, you will get answer about this question about need for service oriented architecture. The first point is isolating business logic. So what is the meaning of this business logic? Isolating the business logic. So students, हमें सर्विस ओरिएंटेड आर्किटेक्चर की ज़रूरत क्यों पड़ी? क्योंकि हमें अपने का जो हमारा जो बिज़नेस लॉजिक है उसको आइसोलेट करना है. बिकॉज द रीज़न इज़ जो बिगेस्ट प्रॉब्लम है प्रोग्रामिंग के अंदर ऑफन जो हमें अक्सर फेस करने में आती है, इट इज़ वेरी डिफ़िकल्ट कि जो हमारा बिज़नेस लॉजिक है उसको हम सेपरेट कर सकें सो कॉल्ड कंप्यूटर लॉजिक से. सो इसीलिए हमें सर्विस ओरिएंटेड आर्किटेक्चर की ज़रूरत पड़ी, क्योंकि हम अपने बिज़नेस लॉजिक को कंप्यूटर लॉजिक से सेपरेट करने की ज़रूरत है. सो दैट्स वाई we need a service oriented architecture. The next important aspect is interoperability. So interoperability हमें service oriented architecture कैसे provide कर सकता है, जैसा कि हमने previously discuss किया कि सर्विस ओरिएंटेड जो हमारे पास आर्किटेक्चर है वो हमें कैसे टेक्निकली किसी भी क्लाइंट को सर्विसेज वो एक्सेस कर सकता है अदर सर्विसेज को रिगार्डलेस जो भी उनका प्लेटफॉर्म है, टेक्नोलॉजी है, वेंडर है और लैंग्वेज इंप्लीमेंटेशन है. ऑल ऑफ दीज कंस्ट्रेंट्स से हटकर वो इन तमाम के तमाम सर्विसेज को एक्सेस कर सकता है. सो इंटरऑपरेबिलिटी भी ग्रेटर लेवल पे प्रोवाइड की जाती है सर्विस ओरिएंटेड आर्किटेक्चर पे. सो दैट्स वाई वी नीड दिस काइंड ऑफ आर्किटेक्चर एज वेल. एंड द लास्ट वन इज रिडंडेंसी. सो व्हाट इज़ रिडंडेंसी? हमें सर्विस ओरिएंटेड आर्किटेक्चर भी प्रोवाइड कर सकता है. सो रिडंडेंसी मीन लाइक यू कैन से दैट we have many similar or yet slightly different applications that can be used throughout the organization. So each department usually comes out with its own version of software components, so there are some redundancies as well. So these are the different reasons. Isolating business logic, interoperability, and the redundancies are the most three common reasons for we need a service oriented architecture. So students, till here in this lecture we discussed distributed software architecture, in which we further discussed client server based architectural pattern and service oriented architecture pattern as well. So student, till here our distributed software architecture topic is comes to an end. So till here our lecture number 20 is ended.